Order, order. Good morning and welcome to today's meeting of the Committee on the Future Relationship with the European Union. I wonder if I could begin by asking our three witnesses to introduce themselves for the record, starting with you, Jane Golding.
Hello, I'm Jane Golding, co-chair of British in Europe, which is the coalition of UK citizens groups across the EU. I am also the co-founder of British in Germany, the national group in Germany of British in Europe.
Thank you. And next, Michael Harris.
My name is Michael Harris, and I'm a member of the steering group of British in Europe, and I'm also the founder of Euro Citizens, which is a citizens' rights group based around Madrid.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, Kalba Meadows.
Good morning. I'm also a member of the steering group of British in Europe, and I'm co-founder of France Rights, which is a citizens' rights platform, core member of British in Europe, dealing solely with information and advocacy on citizens' rights in France.
Well, on behalf of the committee, can I thank the three of you very warmly for giving up your time to give evidence to the committee on this extremely important topic. As you know, we have taken a long interest, as this committee and its predecessor, in the rights of British citizens abroad. And I wanted to kick off, and I suppose this is a question that I'd like all of you to give a brief answer to. The European Commission has described the rights laid down in the withdrawal agreement as broadly the same as those under free movement. Would you agree? And if not, in what respects are they not broadly the same, and what will be the consequences for you and your fellow Brits living and working in Europe? If I could start with you, Jane, please.
Thank you very much, Larry. Broadly the same, only in the host country where we are living now. So that means that we will keep most of the rights that we currently have in the country where we live now, but we will not have any EU-wide rights of free movement, for example, or EU-wide recognition of our qualifications. There are no rights in the withdrawal agreement dealing with cross-border working. And bear in mind, third country nationals who obtain the equivalent status of long-term residence in the EU do have mobility rights. So we have no mobility rights. And this is a key concern for our members, because our members are, contrary to some of the stereotypes, 80% of our members are working age or younger, and they are a very mobile population. And this is one of the #1 concerns of our members across Europe, whether they will be able to continue to work across the EU.
Okay, thank you. Kalba Meadows.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that. Living in France, we have a number of people, well, a very large number of people whose livelihood is based on working in different countries, people with small businesses, people who are employed, and an awful lot of them actually face losing their livelihood. So it's not just a question of rights on a piece of paper, it's something that affects real lives. There are other things lost too, for just by way of an example, the right to bring a future spouse, and other rights of family reunification in future are lost. All of these are things that will affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Michael Harris.
Yeah, in Spain, I mean, there's the stereotype of the Briton who lives in Spain, and there are a lot of retired people in Spain who won't be affected by the need to go to work or to provide cross-border services, but around 60% of Britons in Spain are actually working age or below. And that affects people who are working, and it also affects young people. I'd like to point out that young people, young Britons in the EU are the people who are going to be most affected by this. Their ability to go and study in another country, their ability to move, to go and work. And that's one of the things that we're particularly worried about.
Now, as we know, when this issue was put to the EU side in the first phase of the negotiations around the withdrawal agreement, they said, well, freedom of movement for work purposes, this is a future relationship issue. This is not a citizens' rights issue. And do you have any confidence at all that the problems you've identified may be addressed in the negotiations that are taking place at the moment? Have you had any indication, have you had any feedback either from the UK government or from the Commission negotiators that they understand the point that you are making and are seeking to resolve it? I don't know who would like to go. Jane, can I come back to you first?
Yes, I can go first. I mean, to date, no, we haven't had any indication from either side that this is a topic that is being discussed in any detail as part of the future negotiations. And I think that it really is a question, I suppose, of the level of ambition on mobility rights that the UK seeks in the future negotiations. We've seen both sides, the draft agreements that both sides have put out, and for the moment, these areas are not covered. We've also seen the government's proposed new immigration plans, which would not cover these rights. So at the moment, I think we have only the European Parliament, which adopted a resolution a couple of weeks ago, where it was very clear in the resolution that the European Parliament would like to see a higher level of ambition as far as mobility rights are concerned between the UK and the EU.
And the practical effect for those who are working and who rely currently, the Brits who rely currently on being able to practice their profession by moving between different member states, this is going to be very considerable, I presume.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to point out actually is that last time, 2 years ago, we were giving oral evidence and an MP, Mr. Whittingdale, said, well, why should we get freedom of movement within Europe and his constituents in the UK not have them? And I think there's one thing that's interesting to talk about here. One, we've been actually exercising our rights as EU citizens for a long period of time. And also we are within the market. We are within the single market, but without the rights of the single market. UK citizens will be outside the single market, but they will be within their own market with the opportunities that will give them. So there is a distinction, I think, about why UK citizens in the EU will be more affected than UK citizens who actually live in Britain and haven't exercised their rights.
Because these are rights you've had for a long time, which are going to be taken away unless something is resolved. That's the case.
Rights, yeah, they're rights.
Yes, Kalba.
They're rights that we relied on when we first used our freedom of movement rights to move to our host countries. And if I can come back to your specific question about what are the practical effects, I mean, I can say that we are already seeing instances of people being refused interviews for jobs because those jobs require the freedom to travel across the EU. So there are already, and we're not even at the end of transition yet, there are already real live instances of people's lives and livelihoods being affected, and that will only increase. There are so many jobs that rely on mobility because of the single market.
Yes, I was just going to ask, and then I'll bring you in, Jane, whether as an organisation you have taken any legal advice. Is there any potential legal remedy or case that might be brought when it comes to the implementation of the withdrawal agreement, given that you've just described a very, very significant change in the ability of Brits who've been practicing their free movement rights in pursuit of their profession for a long time to then have that taken away, which is obviously a very significant change. Jane?
On that, I can say, yes, this is something that we've been looking at for the last 3.5 years as an organisation. It's a question really of when would be the right time to test this and at what level, whether it would be at European court level or whether it would be in national jurisdiction. So it's something that we have been considering, particularly since in the case of British citizens in the EU who've moved permanently and use their free movement rights, they have activated those free movement rights. And under the case law, they would therefore arguably have a stronger case of legitimate expectation on which to rely.
But would the forum in which to take such a case be the national court of a member state in respect of the rights in that country, or, as you alluded to, the European Court of Justice? Or could it be both?
It could be both. It could be both. And as we've seen, there are a number of cases going before the European courts at the moment about the issue of whether or not British citizens automatically lose their EU citizenship as a result of the exit of the UK from the EU. So it would be similar sort of cases. The problem is that bringing a case before the European Court, before the General Court, as an individual against a measure of general application is quite difficult, because you have to be able to show direct and individual concern.
Right. Okay. That is extremely helpful. Thank you. Now going to turn to Matt Vickers. Matt, the floor is yours if you could unmute yourself.
Finally achieved that there. It's an open question. I'll let you decide who's best to answer it. Is it clear how many UK citizens are in the EU and how many are likely to be able to secure their rights? And do you expect the number of UK citizens in the EU to increase or decrease before the deadline for registration?
Matt, could you please repeat the second part, the final part of your question? I didn't catch that.
Yeah. Do you expect the number of UK citizens in the EU to increase or decrease before the deadline for registration?
Okay. Perhaps I can start by answering this, and my colleagues can come in and add anything that they wish. Yes, it's quite difficult to estimate the number of UK citizens in the EU. There are various different sources of statistics. The World Bank has put together statistics, and those are the statistics that are usually are relied on 1.2 million British citizens in the EU. ONSS has put together figures as well, although the latest figures took out British citizens based in Ireland. So those figures are around 900,000. Then, of course, you have national figures in each EU member state. And those are probably more reliable because those are figures based on actual numbers of people registered. And probably, as you know, in most EU member states, British citizens have to register as EU citizens. Now, what's interesting, your second question, do we think that there will be more British citizens in the EU? Will the numbers go up? Well, there's a study that is a new study which is being carried out at the moment by Oxford in Berlin and the WZB here based in Berlin, and that's actually looking at figures across the EU 26, and they are basing their figures on a mixture of OECD statistics and national statistics. And what they've actually found, some of the preliminary results of that study include that they have found since 2015 a 30% rise in emigration from the UK to the EU 26. They've also found a 500% increase across the EU in naturalizations, and particularly high in Germany, over 2,000% increase. Since 2016, 31,600 British people have become British Germans, and likely another 10 to 15,000 in 2020.
Yes, Kalba. Meadows.
I'll just pick up again on the point about potentially increasing British populations. That's very much what we're seeing on a grassroots ground level. An enormous increase in the number of people asking questions about how to move, how to register, what the procedure is. It has exponentially increased this year, particularly since no deal was on the table, but this year and now we are seeing huge numbers of people in groups across the countries. France, absolutely, also Greece, Portugal, I'm sure Spain as well, Germany, Sweden, Finland. It's a phenomenon that we're seeing right across the board. In some cases, it's people who already have homes in those countries who are looking to change their residence from UK to residence in the country where they already spend part of the time. I don't know whether I'd go so far as to say it's an exodus from the UK, but it's a very clear movement out of the UK.
Michael, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, in Spain, I mean, Spain is the country with the largest number of UK citizens resident, and the figures vary. The Spanish government statistical organization says 250,000, the ONS says 300. What is clear is that there are a lot of unregistered Britons living here, and in theory there is an obligation to register, but there are a lot of people who spend more than 6 months a year here. And they are actually one of the groups that we're most worried about in terms of guaranteeing, of achieving rights after the end of transition. So the figures here, and I think this is the same in Portugal too, where British and Portugal mentioned 30,000 unregistered Britons. It's very difficult to quantify because there are people who are under the radar, and it's an issue that the statistics just don't figure in the statistics.
Matt, did you?
I think I'm happy with that. That was a comprehensive answer.
You're happy?
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Nigel Mills. Nigel, over to you.
Morning. Can I ask about? I just want to ask about how people will evidence that they are UK nationals who are entitled to live in their chosen EU country rather than just a UK national that's turned up on holiday. And I think there's an idea for an EU-wide document or ID card for that. Do you have any thoughts on the proposals for that EU-wide document, and any weaknesses or things you'd like to see adding to it?
I can speak to that if you like,
Okay.
to begin with, and then others can follow on. Yes, in February, the European Commission actually published an implementation document which suggested the format of a cross-EU-wide biometric document, physical document, which would evidence the rights of people who are covered under the withdrawal agreement. Now, we welcome very much the fact that a physical document will be made available, which is hugely important for people so that they have recognizable rights, that they can easily demonstrate that they're covered under the withdrawal agreement for accessing services, for travel, for employment, and every other reason under the sun. There's one issue with the format in that proposed document, and it's this. It doesn't make a distinction between those who have permanent residence rights and those who have ordinary or temporary residence rights. Now, in the EU, people acquire permanent residence rights when they've lived legally in their host countries for 5 years. At that point, the conditions that they had to meet in order to be legally resident fall away, and they are then able to live condition-free. So it's a very, very important change point for people. Without evidence that somebody is legally resident on a permanent residence basis, then there are going to be difficulties for them because so many things across the board rely on having a permanent residence right. So we feel it's very, very important that the document actually shows not just that somebody has rights under the withdrawal agreement, but that if they have them, they have permanent residence rights under the agreement.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Can I just say something? Yeah. There is also an issue here that we've been raising in Spain with the Spanish government, and British in Europe has been raising with the Commission, is the element of people who have potentially the option to have other statuses. Now, the ID card is for a third country national protected by the withdrawal agreement. So all Britons should be protected by that. But there are also thousands of Britons, particularly in our group, a lot of people who are family members of an EU citizen. And they're in a bit of a cleft stick here, because there are two statuses, and we want to find out what's going to happen. You know, will they have to opt for one or the other? In which case they could lose their rights under the withdrawal agreement. And the other option is also if they want to get long-term residence, EU long-term residence, which has more mobility rights. So there are the issue of conflicting statuses is something relevant to third country national status under the withdrawal agreement.
Jane, I think you want to come as well?
Yes, I just wanted to comment as well on another group that needs documentation. I was talking about the number of people who are taking citizenship of other countries. And dual citizens are also covered by the withdrawal agreement and have rights under the withdrawal agreement, in addition to the rights that they have as citizens of the host country where they're living. So, for example, they may be, you may have taken German citizenship, but your qualifications will still be British, and there are rights under the withdrawal agreement for recognition of those. Or you may have, there's also family reunification rights, which are probably more favourable than national or ordinary EU third country national rights. So dual citizens, it's not clear how they'll actually be able to document those rights, because clearly it doesn't really make sense for them to be applying for a residence card, given that they already have residence rights based on their citizenship.
Okay, and are all EU countries agreeing to issue this EU-wide document in that format, or are some deciding they want to use their own national style and refusing to do the Europe-wide one?
They're all agreeing, because it's an implementing decision at EU level and it applies across the board. The only option they have is what they actually write on the document, whether they indicate the distinction between permanent or ordinary residence or not.
So while I'm asking about, I guess, how well it's been implemented across the EU, are there any countries who are being particularly slow at implementing the withdrawal agreement rights that we should be concerned about, or are they all progressing well to achieve it by the end of the year? And have you got any information on where might be worst performing or where might be best performing?
Yeah, I can start with that. I think the first thing to say is that across the EU, things are very, very much further behind than they are in the UK. So in many countries, implementation hasn't begun. In fact, there are only 3 EU countries where implementation has begun. So we are looking at a very different scenario. The countries where implementation has begun are Italy, which is a declaratory country. Now, by declaratory, I'm not sure whether all of the committee understand the difference between 2 systems that member states can implement. That there's a declaratory system which mirrors exactly what happens now in relation to EU citizens, and their rights are simply conferred under the law. So in the withdrawal agreement, their rights are conferred by the withdrawal agreement. They don't have to do any procedures, comply with any administration in order to have those rights. Alternatively, under the withdrawal agreement, member states can choose a constitutive system, which is rather different, and that requires an application to be made by each person for a new status and rights that go with it. So without an application in a constitutive system, there are no rights. Now, right now, where we are, we have 13 countries that have chosen a constitutive system and 14 that have chosen a declaratory system. Unfortunately, there is still no public list available of which countries have chosen what. Some we know because they've made public statements, but there is still, at this very late stage, with 6 months to go to the end of transition, we still don't have a complete public list. So already you can see that there are difficulties because some countries, for example, Greece, do not know publicly what system they're even going to be operating. So we have 3 countries that have begun implementation. The Netherlands and Malta. Malta has suspended because of COVID, but the Netherlands is proceeding, as is Italy. 2 of those are constitutive. Some other countries have legislation in place, but they haven't begun implementing. Many, many other countries don't even have legislation in place. Some have draft legislation, which has not yet been finalized. We don't have any start dates now, other than the ones that are already implementing. We don't have any start dates planned until October. I can talk a little bit about France because it's actually quite a pertinent example of where things are. France is going to be constitutive. It's going to operate via an online application system for all 150 to 200,000, possibly even more, residents in France. It's a particularly difficult country because it has not, since 2002, it has not required EU citizens to register. So as things stand at the moment, less than 20% of British nationals living in France already have a residence card. So it's very much starting at zero. It's a very, very big task. So it's going to be an online system. And having made the application online, applications will then be farmed out to departmental registration offices, of which there are over 100. So it's going to take some time. The system was due to open in July, on the 1st of July, so tomorrow. On Friday night, this Friday night just passed, a decision was taken by the French government that it needed to postpone the beginning of the launch of the system for 3 months until October. So a very, very late postponement decision, of which nothing was really known in advance. So we now have a new date of the 1st of October. So, you know, a very short time before the end of the transition period, and only 9 months now in France to complete applications for potentially 200,000 people or more.
Okay.
That's not atypical.
And do you think that the European Commission should be doing more to monitor
Could I say something, Mr. Mills?
Yeah.
I mean, in Spain, everything was going fine until February, basically until the lockdown, everything started to happen. We had a couple of meetings with the Spanish government. They told us that it was a declaratory system, that there would be not such an obligation, there was no legal obligation, it would be just confirming status. But since then, everything has gone haywire. Basically, you know, we've had very severe lockdown, and things are only beginning to move now. The Spanish government has said that they will be announcing information about the ID card, the third country national ID card protected under the withdrawal agreement next month, and we hope to have another meeting with them. So, you know, everything has actually been on ice because of that. But there are other issues, you know, there are 2 issues here. One is that transition is actually just disappearing, it's slipping away. So time is of the essence, as you say. And also the kind of anxiety levels of people are also very high. One final thing is that actually being in a declaratory country like Spain doesn't mean everything is plain sailing, because there is no legal deadline. There's not going to be any legal cliff beyond which you become illegal. But in practice, you will need to demonstrate your new status after the 31st of January of December to be able to travel in and out of the Schengen zone, and in Spain to access services, etc. And so to get this documentation, you'll have to go through the system. And Britons will now in Spain no longer be in the more benevolent EU regime. They will be under the third country regime, which is slower, more cumbersome, and more difficult. So that's something that we're worried about, because there could be people who can't demonstrate that they have the rights under the withdrawal agreement who can be affected.
Okay, Jane, you had some comments, I think.
Yes, I just wanted to add something about Germany, because that's that country with the third largest population. We have draft legislation has been published. That was published during the crisis. There's no doubt, what Michael and Kalba have said is that the crisis has affected the speed with which countries have brought out their draft legislation and started to implement. I mean, obviously, no deal was only ruled out at the end of last year, and before that, EU countries were actually dealing with no deal contingency plans. So then they had to get going at the beginning of the year on implementing the withdrawal agreement. And in Germany, we're expecting, we don't have a timescale yet, but we are expecting that the draft legislation will be adopted over the summer, and that implementation will start not before September.
Okay, but as far as the three of you are aware, there's no particular countries we should be concerned that are going to be miles behind. It sounds like all the ones you've talked about have got some sort of plan in place, perhaps except Greece. Are there any others that we should really be watching out for?
I think it's actually very early to say, because so little implementation has yet begun. So we don't have the experience to know how the systems are going to work in each country. But it's an important point that it's not enough just to have the rights on paper. It's the processes by which those rights are implemented that is important in real life, because you may have the rights on paper, but unless, especially in a constitutive country, unless you can demonstrate that you have those rights, you may as well not have them.
Okay. Jane, you want to come back?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one last point, Ms. Mills, which was that we would like to emphasize again how important it is for us to actually have a public list, a publicly confirmed list now of which countries are constitutive, because obviously those are the countries where we have most concern, because there is a deadline, the June 2021. Two of those countries that have chosen a constitutive system, Sweden and Finland, have already decided to extend the deadline to the end of September. Their draft legislation provides for that. That's not adopted yet, but they've already set that out in the draft legislation. So really for us, we're pushing hard, both with our contacts in the UK government and in the Commission, to have a publicly confirmed list so that our members know exactly what they need to do, whether they need to apply and get a decision, or whether they're in a declaratory system where they simply have to register and apply for a residence card.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Next, Dr. Philippa Whitford. Philippa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. If I could start with Jane, and again, if others just join in. Obviously, you've referenced that the UK is further ahead with preparation for EU citizens living here. And for those who've got an unbroken employment record, that seems to be working relatively smoothly. But what I'm seeing as an MP, and other people will be having the same, is that if people have gaps in their employment, they're having to produce a lot of different evidence. And of course, they were never expecting to go through this. So often it's things that are quite difficult to find. And that does seem to affect those with caring responsibilities, which, may still in 2020 be majority will be women. Are you having the same issues in the European countries of having to scrabble around and find whole batches of evidence? And is there anything that the UK government can do to try and ease that?
Well, thanks for the question, Philippa. The problem that we face at the moment is, because we are quite a long way behind with implementation, is we would anticipate that you would see the same sort of issues and the same sort of need to come up with a large pile of documentation to prove your rights. But since most countries haven't started implementing yet, we cannot yet be sure or confirm how much of a problem that will be. One issue we do have is we would like to know how the conditions are going to be applied to everybody, because the conditions that you have to fulfill under the withdrawal agreement are inspired by the 2004 EU Directive on Free Movement. And basically, you either have to show you're employed, self-employed, or you have sufficient resources and health insurance, or you're a student with sufficient resources and health insurance. So what we want to know is whether member states are going to continue to apply the conditions in the same way as they did to us as EU citizens, or whether retrospectively we might be subject to stricter application. And that, of course, will also affect the groups that you were talking about. But I think maybe Kalba could also come in and say something about this point in relation to France.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly speak to France, but I also think it's a valid point to make that under the 2004 directive, there is a very wide variety across the EU 27 countries as to exactly what levels of documentation they ask for, and also how strictly they test the conditions for legal residence. France, for example, for those who do apply for a residence card, does require quite an enormous amount of documentation. A couple of years ago, I applied for a permanent residence card, and I actually had to produce quite a hefty file of, it must have been well over 30 documents, and added to that, many of them that were UK-based had to be translated. So I had quite a large file. Every one of those documents was needed and every one was requested. So it varies a lot. Sweden and Finland also have hefty documentation requirements. Other countries actually take things much more on trust. So, for example, if somebody is economically inactive and they live on their own resources, some countries will accept that on trust, that they haven't made a claim on the state social security system, and that's enough. In France, you actually have to prove your income and that it's durable, sustainable, and a safe income. And if you're applying retrospectively, as I did for permanent residence, you would have to prove that for a 5-year period. So there is a huge variety, and although it is far too early to know how states are going to implement the withdrawal agreement, I'd be very surprised if we didn't see a similar variety across different states. It's not just a variety across states, we can also see varieties within states, because a number of member states, France included, devolve the processing of an application claim or a registration claim to individual local authorities. We have 101 in France. In Italy, it's devolved to, I think it's 6,000 different local authorities. So you get a huge potential for differences in policies towards processing. There's also an issue there because where it's devolved to that level, staff never become truly proficient because they don't actually have very many cases to deal with. So you don't develop expertise, and that can lead to errors, and it can lead to differences in the way claims are processed.
The 3 million here representing EU citizens in the UK, obviously we're pushing for a declaratory system, which you referred to, which at least means everyone who is already settled here is legally protected. But obviously you were touching on the need to prove that. So what would you see as the ideal? Would it be a declaratory system but with a registration? Because there's been a lot of discussion in the UK, and as you referred to earlier, the need to have something that proves that you have the right to remain permanently.
Could I come in there, Philippa?
Yep, sure.
The system that has been put in place in Germany under the draft legislation is, in fact, that it's a declaratory system, but as under current EU law under the 2004 Free Movement Directive, with a compulsory registration component. So you must register, and then you may apply and receive your card. Your rights are still derived from the treaty, so your rights do not depend on the decision of the authorities, but you do have to register.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in Germany, my husband's German, so I know it quite well. You have to register anyway. I mean, Germans have to register. Yes. Kalba, just if you wanted to add anything to that yourself, and then maybe Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that to give you a straight answer to your straight question, then yes, the declaratory system is a preferable system, and it's something that we were advocating for throughout the negotiation period. Unfortunately, when the UK chose to opt for a constitutive system, it was inevitable that certain member states would follow suit. But as you know, the current system is declaratory. We all have rights under that current system. It would have been a far preferable system for all of us. Reapplying or applying for a new status is a huge source of anxiety for people, as you know from the UK, in all constitutive countries.
Do you think that the UK and Commission should have hammered out harder when in the central discussions to aim for the least disruptive, as in a declaratory system, but with registration, so that you definitely have the proof? We don't want another Windrush right across Europe due to lack of documentation. Do you think there should have been more work at that point to get something that would be agreed right across the EU and in the UK?
It would have been.
If Kalba finishes first, and then
just one sentence really. I think in the UK, I think there was always a misunderstanding about a declaratory system. I think it was believed, and this is the case in certain member states too, I think it was believed that under a declaratory system, you cannot request people to register or hold a residence card. And as Jane's just explained, that's not in fact the case, but I think it was a misunderstanding that maybe informed the UK's choice of a constitutive system.
In Italy, people who don't have that are going to struggle to access health care, because obviously we will have left the European health insurance card system. Is there a lot of anxiety among UK citizens in Europe about accessing these kind of services after the transition? If I start with you, Kalba, and then to Michael and Jane to finish.
This is precisely why it's so incredibly important to have physical proof, a physical document. Under the withdrawal agreement, it's in fact only constitutive systems which have to provide a document. For the declaratory system is a kind of afterthought in the withdrawal agreement, and it simply says that people whose rights have been confirmed under the withdrawal agreement under a declaratory system may apply for the document. But it doesn't actually make it compulsory to issue one. So it's going to be very important for people to make that application for a document. And that's what's happening in Italy at the moment, which has begun implementation under a declaratory system. People are being invited to request a certificate to show that they're covered under the withdrawal agreement, but it's crucial.
Okay, and to yourself, Michael?
Well, it's the same here, actually. But yeah, the situation is that legally you won't have to do it, but actually practically you will if you want to be able to live in the country, access services, and come in and out of the country too. And the other thing, I mean, we talked about variety within countries. That's particularly important in Spain because, as you know, there are autonomous regions, and within the autonomous regions there are town councils and whatever. So there's an awful lot of difference, and in terms of requirements currently, there are some areas, some provinces seem to be stricter than others. And that's something that we need to really monitor when when implementation begins in Spain. The other final thing is that there are bottlenecks in Spain. The population isn't spread evenly around the country. It's a very large country, but there are huge concentrations in two provinces, basically Alicante in the east on the coast, and Malaga in the south on the Costa del Sol. So they're going to be the places that are kind of hot spots in terms of implementation, and the ones that we're most worried about.
And to yourself, Jane.
I would just echo what both Kalba and Michael have said about the importance of documentation in both systems, constitutive and declaratory. You also mentioned health services. Obviously, the UK citizens living in the EU who are covered by the withdrawal agreement are also covered by the part of the withdrawal agreement which continues the coordinated social security system for that group of people, as well as EU citizens in the UK. So they will still be able to have access to health services, and those who are not in the local or national system will still be able to have access to S1s, for example, will still have access to EHICs.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next, it's Joanna Cherry. Joanna, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm particularly interested in the plight of those British citizens who spend a large part of the year in an EU country, for example, Spain or France, but aren't actually resident there. Now, Michael, your evidence refers to the large amount of people who spend several months of the year in Spain at present and the rest of the year in the United Kingdom, many of whom may not have registered with the Spanish authorities because they don't really consider themselves as resident there. What are their options if they cannot or choose not to secure protection under the withdrawal agreement in Spain?
Well, I mean, it depends obviously on the future relationship and what kind of mobility is offered in the future relationship. But, I mean, the most likely thing is to have a visa-free travel, but to have the limits, the Schengen limits, which is 90 days out of 180 days. So that's going to happen. I mean, basically, if people spending up to 6 months a year, we would encourage them to register in Spain to get healthcare and to meet their fiscal obligations too, because living in a country really for longer than 6 months, really in the EU under EU law, after being 3 months in a country, you should register. So we basically think that people should try and should register if they want to spend that amount of time in Spain.
What about people who have, say, a second home in Spain and are toing and froing? They might go over for a couple of months in the spring, then come back and then go over later in the summer. And I'll come to Kalba about people in France with these arrangements in a moment. If matters rest with just the Schengen arrangement, which you've described, where people can stay for up to 90 days in any 180-day period, do you see any problems arising for British citizens who want to go backwards and forwards in the way that I've described and are accustomed to doing so if matters just rest with the Schengen visa?
Well, I mean, things will change. I mean, this is something that we found, we realized, in the beginning of 2017, that we would no longer be EU citizens, we would be third country nationals. So the treatment, basically in Spain, the EU directive of 3 months hasn't been enforced. So people have been able to come and go as they like. That will change, so there will be that limit. I mean, of course, there's the other thing. If there is no deal, if there's no trade deal, there is the danger that Britons will need to have a visa as well. So, that's another problem.
And, what issues arise if somebody has to apply for a visa? I mean, say there's no deal and matters rest with the 90 days in the 180-day Schengen arrangement. If somebody wants to go for longer than 90 days, they'll have to get a visa, won't they?
Well, it could be that they need a visa anyway. I mean, if there's no free trade deal, they will need to have there could be no visa-free travel.
Well, if you have to, let's just look at the situation where you have to apply for a visa. As I understand it, you have to evidence that you have insurance and a certain amount of monthly income and prove that. And you also may have to go through an interview process. That's right, isn't it?
I don't know that. Jane, I don't know.
I can speak to that.
Kalba's putting her hand up, and I wonder if I could come to you, Kalba, because there are quite a large number of British people in France who spend part of the year in France. That's correct, isn't it?
It is correct.
And are you able to put any figure on the number of British people who spend part of the year in France?
The answer to that is no. Figures are very difficult to come by for second homers. I can give you an example from my region, which is Occitanie, where it is reckoned that just over 14,000 second homes are owned by British people. Now that's it's not a particularly high proportion of second homes. It's something like 5%, because very many French people own second homes, but it's a considerable number. But yes, because of the proximity of the UK and France, it's traditionally been a very popular place for second homes.
And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the British people who've bought second homes in France, these are not necessarily wealthy people, as we would understand it. They may be people who have pooled a small inheritance to buy a property, done it up, and then are living off a pension. I mean, I'm interested in these sorts of people. Do these people exist?
Yes, they do, because property has for a long time been much cheaper in France. So it's many of those people that are now seriously considering whether to become resident, whether to actually spend rather more than 6 months a year, because that's their first option. Many of them would spend, for example, 5 months in France and 7 months in the UK. Many of them are now considering whether to change that, spend 7 months in France and apply for residence under the withdrawal agreement. To do that, they would need to be resident here by the end of the transition period. And there are, I can imagine right now, there are many conversations going on in homes of people who have second homes. So that's their first option.
Yeah.
Their other options are to accept the 90, 180 day rule, which doesn't necessarily mean that they get to spend 90 days out of 180 in their second home, because if they want to travel elsewhere in the Schengen agreement, whether it's for work or pleasure, that also comes out of their 90-day allocation. So it may be that they can actually spend less time in their second home. Or their third option is to apply for a long stay visa, which is what you were talking about earlier. And yes, they would have to do that before each trip. They would have to apply to the consulate of the country where their second home is before they travel. It very often involves a physical journey, an interview, money, needing to show proof of travel, needing to show how they can support themselves, and very often healthcare. So it's onerous. It can be done. There are people who do it regularly. There are people who spend time every couple of years from Australia, from the States. So it can be done. But, I mean, these are issues all to do with mobility, to do with free movement rights that British in Europe has been raising for the last 3 years. And of course, they also affect us as people who've made permanent homes in our host countries and have lives, families, jobs that we stand to lose part of through losing our free movement rights.
Kalba, when you raise these issues with the British government, what sort of purchase are you getting? Because I have constituents in the position that I've just described, people of modest means who have a small second home in France and who are concerned that they won't be able to afford the travel insurance required for the visa that you've described, and they won't be able to evidence the necessary income. And I know that they've clubbed together with other MPs' constituents to lobby the government on these issues. But my impression is they're not getting very far, and they're not getting much purchase with the UK government in trying to achieve a deal whereby there will be, for example, 6 months visa-free travel. Are you able to help us with what purchase you've got when you've lobbied with the British government?
Well, to be clear here, our remit is to advocate for people who have exercised their free movement rights.
Right.
So people who are legally resident in the EU. Our remit isn't to lobby for people who have second homes, who haven't left the UK, who haven't exercised their own free movement rights. So what purchase second homers might get is completely contingent on how, I think as someone said earlier, how ambitious the UK wants to be in looking at free under mobility rights under the future relationship. Right now, the situation for British people under the Schengen Agreement, if the 180-day rule is what happens, it's the same as for any other third country. So it's a consequence, if you like, of becoming a third country instead of an EU member state.
And it's a consequence that if it's not addressed by the British government in the negotiations, the EU, it will rest as you have described.
Indeed.
That's right. Now, I see that Jane wants to come in.
Yes, I wanted to just come in and add, thank you, Jana, to what Kalba had said. As she's explained, we're a volunteer grassroots group, so we've got limited resources. So we have been lobbying on behalf of those who've moved permanently, who have residence rights. And of course, we fully understand all the difficulties of second homers as well, but we've lobbied for this group of people with our limited resources, and who and we have raised over and over again how important movement outside of our host country is for those of us in this population. Now, we are the people, I mean, we're sort of the canary in the coal mine. We are on the front line because we were dealt with in the first phase, our rights. And we are the people who've actually activated fully our free movement rights and moved and made lives in other countries. And we have not got free movement or continuing free movement across the EU outside of our host states.
Yes. And I think I'm grateful to you, Jane, for clarifying that. And I think everyone recognises the amazing work that you and others in British and Europe have done, and the huge assistance you've been to this committee and our understanding the problems that you and your members of the group face. I suppose the issue that I'm raising about British people who are still toing and froing between Britain and the UK, in order to clarify those, we might want to speak to a specific campaign group that's set up for them, such as the 180 Days Visa-Free campaign. Have you heard of them?
I think that we've heard mention of them in the press. We haven't actually, they haven't been in contact with us.
I believe the committee may have had some correspondence from them, but that's perhaps something that the committee can pursue at a later date. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We now move to Rupa Huck. Rupa,
hello
over
there.
to you.
Hi. Morning, everyone. As we all know, coronavirus is sort of the only story in town at the moment. So I just wanted to ask about sort of how COVID-19 travel restrictions might be affecting the physical ability of people to participate in processes around residence and citizenship. And I think I understand that Germany has extended things until the 31st of December, certainly for dual citizenship. Is that right? So
that's right.
So Germany is kind of okay, but just to Kalba first and then to Michael, how has COVID-19 affected the preparation and implementation of whatever system is going to be introduced in, first of all, France and then in Spain?
Okay, so speaking for France, the delay that I talked about earlier in implementing the withdrawal agreement, delay is a direct result of COVID. As a result of COVID, the registration offices around the country have a 3-month backlog in processing residence applications from third country nationals. And it was felt that because of that, it wouldn't be possible to do justice to a whole load of applications from a whole new group. So COVID was directly responsible for the delay. It's affected ordinary people's lives in many ways too. Many people have been kept in the UK if they'd gone to the UK on a visit. Some people spend time there with relatives or even to work, and have been unable to come back to France. That's led to concerns about, for example, whether they are going to have issues with the continuous residence rules, whether they may be at risk of being away from the country too long and losing their legal resident status. Because implementation hasn't been done in France, it hasn't yet affected that to them directly, but obviously the delay is a major effect. There's been economic effects on people too, just as it has everywhere else. People have found they've been unable to work, unable to carry on their businesses. They've seen their income reduced. Many have had to apply for grant, aid, help put in place by the French government, and there have been concerns about whether that would affect their resident status in future. They've been assured that it won't. So that's one thing, but there is without a doubt a very hefty effect from COVID in France.
So 3-month backlog. I mean, that's with these administrative offices being closed. Do we have a timescale of when they're going to reopen? And I think you also said before with the federal system, it's kind of uneven between regions. Can you tell us more about that?
Implementation is due to begin now on the 1st of October on the online platform. So everybody will apply on this online platform. After that, the application form, the online application form, will be distributed to People's Regional Registration Office, of which there are 101 altogether. So some of those offices are very busy. They have very big immigrant and migration sections. They have large numbers of British residents too. We hope that the 3-month delay will give them long enough to catch up a little and to actually clear the decks so that they're ready for implementation in October. We very much hope that there won't be a second delay, but it's clearly worrying. It's something that we're concerned about. The reaction from British people in France was quite overwhelming on Saturday morning when it was announced. We actually spent 2 days fielding questions. I personally answered something like 250 questions on that day from concerned people.
Gosh, okay, second delay, we hope also no second spike. And are there anything like sort of language testing? I know all those sort of things in the UK, there's the citizenship in the UK test where they ask about the royal family and that stuff. Is there anything equivalent?
There are no language tests under the withdrawal agreement. It's not something that is permitted under the withdrawal agreement, just as it's not for EU citizens. If somebody wants, for example, and that this is the issue of combined statuses, if somebody wants to apply for, let's say, third country national long-term directive status, which is the status that does have some very limited mobility rights, then they may well be subject to language testing in most countries to obtain that status. But as yet, we don't have clarity on how or whether it would be possible even to combine two statuses. But no, there is no language testing. It's very much a mirror of what happens now for EU citizens.
Thank you. And Michael, can you give us a perspective from Spain?
Basically, as I said before, everything's been on ice, or was on ice from mid-March when the lockdown came in, and it was particularly strict lockdown in Spain. in early June, things have started, the kind of wheels of bureaucracy have started to grind once more, slowly. And you know, a lot of people, a lot of civil servants are working from home. So there are appointments for residency and nationality. So there are the two very different tracks there. We have noticed, you know, there has been a big increase in numbers of people asking, going for Spanish nationality, even though you have to make a declaration that you renounce your British nationality. But that has increased. There have been very big delays. One, for example, one of our members had an appointment in May, and that was put back till January next year. Residents, again, there are delays. So it's beginning to kind of get back into action. Hopefully, when the Spanish government announces the ID card for British people protected by the withdrawal agreement in July, things will start moving. But we don't know. We don't really know because you know, as I said before, there isn't going to be a legal deadline because we're a declaratory country. But we are worried about what's going to happen after the 1st of January in terms of documentation that people will have to travel, to prove things, etc. So we'll have to speak to the, you know, that's still up in the air, basically. We'll speak to the Spanish government hopefully very soon about that.
Thanks. And Jane, you had your hand up as well.
Yes, Rupert, I just wanted to give a quick clarification on that point about citizenship applications in Germany. You're right that we have the same issue as in Spain, the issue that Michael has raised about dual citizenship, because in Germany, usually you can only hold dual citizenship if your other citizenship is an EU citizenship. So British citizens will no longer have this automatic right post end of transition. Germany did decide unilaterally to extend the period till the end of transition, so people can still apply for citizenship and keep their British citizenship at the moment. But because of the COVID crisis, citizenship tests, language tests have been cancelled, and obviously in-person appointments, there are backlogs for those, they've been cancelled. So, you know, there's a deadline to get this done by the end of the year and fulfill the conditions by the end of the year. So it is a real concern in Germany as well.
And they're not Zoomifying them as we are with this committee.
In some places, yeah. Here in Berlin, I know they are doing some of their work virtually, yes. But I mean, again, we have a federal system here in Germany. So it depends which land you're talking about. So in Berlin, in the land of Berlin, we have one central foreigners office dealing with all the applications. In the biggest state in Germany, North Rhine-Westphalia, where the largest population of British people live, there are 84 different offices. So that also means, I mean, different offices have different ways of dealing with citizenship applications. So you see a similar pattern to in France, for example.
And just one more to all three of you. The British in Europe have called on member states to adopt a flexible and understanding approach to those who are unable to meet the strict conditions for residence as a result of COVID-19. Have any member states said that time lost due to COVID-19 is going to be formally factored in and taken into account? Because, I mean, presumably there is nothing stopping any individual member state making that decision. Where there's a will, there's a way. So should we go in the same order then? Kalba, then Michael, and finally Jane.
France hasn't made any specific statements yet about any amendments to dates as a result of COVID. We hope it will. And the point is being made to the government that, especially given the recent delays, it will be appropriate.
And do we know of any other member states apart from the three that people are kind of from here today between us? Yeah, Jane, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, just to say, both Finland and Sweden have decided to extend the deadline for applications until the end of September 2021. And they're both constitutive countries where you actually have to make an application, get a decision from the authorities in order to have your status.
All right. Those progressive Nordic countries again. And then Michael Harris, have you got anything to add?
Well, in Spain, it's all a bit slower, as I said, so we don't know. I mean, they haven't announced.
They're having a siesta.
So, well, they're recovering from very heavy COVID, actually, particularly in Madrid. I mean, it's been really terrible. So, you know, here we don't know. But, I mean, we're confident that the Spanish government will be generous. When on the no deal preparations, which the Spanish government were very quick on, and they produced a law very quickly. It actually they gave a long grace period. They were pretty good on that kind of thing. So we don't see any reason to suggest that shouldn't be the case.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Next, it's Sally Ann Hart. Sally Ann, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to, yes, good. I think it's still morning. Yes, good morning to our witnesses. Yes, hello there. I think I'm going to look at the support for UK citizens in the EU and the funding that's been given to facilitate settlement status. I am aware that funding has been in place since 2018, November 2018, and for UK citizens in the European Union, and there has been funding, substantial funding for European Union citizens in the UK. So my question is essentially, what help has the UK government provided to groups like yours to help secure your rights? Shall I give that to Michael first in Spain?
Well, the answer is that they have given none to us as groups actually campaigning for citizens' rights. There has been money given to things called the UK National Support Fund, which goes to groups that are working throughout Europe. In Spain, there are three that are here. There's the International Organization for Migration, that's in Madrid, Murcia, and Malaga and Andalusia. There is the Barbelia, an association called Barbelia in Alicante, and then there's Age Concern Spain in the northeast, in Catalonia and Baleares. So basically, they're the groups who have been funded to help UK citizens to deal with registration. And here it's only started up. There is the Age Concern in Catalonia and the Baleares have a helpline already going. We haven't spoken to them, but we've spoken to the other two groups. Our representative in Alicante, Margaret Hales, is actually today with the Barbelia group visiting a foreigner's office with one of the people that they're helping. There are 4 people from Barbelia in Alicante, which is one of the big provinces, the hotspot, so that's very good news. Yesterday, I spoke to the people from the International Organization for Migration in Madrid, and they've got 1 person in Madrid, 1 person in Murcia, and 1 person in Andalusia. We're particularly worried about Andalusia because Andalusia is the same size physically as England, and there are huge numbers of people in Malaga, the kind of hotspot, the Costa del Sol. Who knows how many people there are, but probably over 100,000 Britons. And that looks a bit worrying. So, you know, it's very good. We're pleased that the Foreign Office has funded organisations. We have to see how it goes. It's too early to tell how well they're doing and how well things are covered. But as I said before, the Andalusia situation looks pretty worrying.
And just in Spain, so a further question, which I will ask to everyone as well, is have UK citizens in Spain had any help at all from national or local government organisations, Spanish government or national or local?
No, because I mean nothing has actually started happening yet. So they haven't actually, the whole implementation of the withdrawal agreement hasn't actually started because there's no ID card yet. What they're doing at the moment is helping people register as EU citizens first, so that they are ready. The process will be easier for them to get the third country national ID card when it comes out. So that hopefully will happen in July.
Thank you. I'll move over to Kalba now on the same question. So what help has the I know they've got the support fund. The UK government has given funding to local organisations that contracted to do the help for people in France. So has the UK government, other than the funding to organisations, provided any other help to you to help secure your rights? And have you had help from the French government at national or local level?
No, there's been no other funding other than what's given to the three support fund organisations that are operating in France, which I'd like to say just something about in a moment. There has been no other funding given either by the UK or by the French government. Communications plans are not highly developed in France, so there has not yet been any robust communication between either the French government or the embassy and British citizens to advise them what to do. That's something we still await, and that obviously in a country which doesn't currently require registration is incredibly important. Just very briefly on the operation of the support fund in France, we have just three organisations. We have a very unequal geographical coverage. Only Brittany, Normandy, Paris and Dordogne are covered, which represents a very small percentage. Some support is given to forces veterans through SAFA, but if you put all of those together, best possible scenario is that only 23% of British people living in France will have access to the support fund. So that does raise some questions for us as to how the decisions to allocate the funds were taken, how organisations, what kind of criteria organisations were assessed on, what their ability is to provide the help that they need. Only one of the organisations that's been funded in France has any previous experience at all in citizens' rights. The other two are starting from zero. And we have some concerns about the level of expertise that they can bring to the scenario. The rights under the withdrawal agreement are incredibly complicated, as we know from all of the work that we've done on it. So we do have concerns about getting it right under a constitutive system. Getting correct information to people is absolutely vital, and it can make the difference between them obtaining a resident status or not obtaining a resident status. And if they were to fail to obtain a resident status through lack of expertise in helping them through the process, then that's a very, very worrying situation. And there has to be robust monitoring of the operation of the funds throughout France, indeed throughout the EU where they've been allocated. And this really needs to be done on an ongoing basis. It's also kind of worrying that only 3, possibly 4 of the countries that, I say 3 or 4 because we still don't have the definitive list of constitutive and declaratory, only 3 or 4 of the countries that have received funding are constitutive countries. And whereas obviously there is still a need in declaratory countries, the need is much greater in a constitutive country because of the need to apply for a new status. And because of the cliff edge that people face, no application, no status. No status, no residence rights. So it really is that crucial. So there are also questions for us in, again, how those decisions were made, why it is that France, given that it has the second highest population of British people across the EU, why only 23% are covered and why there are such large geographical gaps. So we would be looking for very robust monitoring to ensure that the organisations can actually come up with the goods. There's one other thing to say about that, and they do have a very limited remit. Their remit is only helping people with an application form, a kind of hand-holding remit, if you like. But some of the very biggest and most important questions will actually be about whether somebody is legally resident. And these are like legal immigration questions that are outside the remit of the funded organisations. Only one of them has a lawyer on board. So it begs the question of where people are going to get that kind of advice. People in more marginal situations, people who have concerns about whether they're going to be able to meet the conditions. Remember that 80% of people in France have never applied for a residence card. So their ability to meet the conditions has never been tested. It's a new thing for them. Hence the level of anxiety that's around, and it's huge. 50% of people who replied to a survey that we did very recently, 50% of people say they feel anxious, very anxious, or crippled by the process that's to come.
Okay, thank you. And Jane in Berlin.
Yes, hi. Well, I'll echo what both Kalba and Michael have said. There's been no funding to organisations in Germany like our own, other than to the organisations who tendered under the UK National Support Fund. As far as those are concerned, there are two in Germany. Again, the International Organisation of Migration, and then SAFA, which is the Veterans Organisation. IOM covers 12 of the states in Germany, and SAFA covers 4, but there are concerns because their remit, their scope is only to deal with the issues of veterans rather than ordinary British citizens living in Germany. And one of the 4 states in which SAFA is active is Nordrhein-Westfalen, which is the largest German state and home to the largest British population. So there are concerns in terms of geographical scope and demographic scope in Germany as well. As far as the help that we've had otherwise, I mean, implementation hasn't started here in Germany either, although we have the draft legislation published, but we have had extensive contacts, British in Germany, with both the embassy, and there's a very good person based as a citizens' rights officer in the embassy in post in Berlin, but also we have had extensive engagement and contacts with the German authorities, and we have run with the British Embassy and German officials information evenings, even though at this stage implementation hasn't started, but keeping British citizens up to date with what the current status is. And those we've done with the British Embassy across Germany, and latterly more and more with German officials. We had our first meeting with the Brexit lead negotiator for Germany back in 2017, and we've probably had about, I would say, 10 or 13 meetings in total since then. So and with other ministries as well.
So you would say that the German authorities have engaged with UK citizens in Germany to try and facilitate their status in Germany?
Yes, I would say so, and not just at federal level, also at regional level. We have been asked to come and for meetings at regional level as well.
So Jane, just following on from that, do you think then that the responsibility for informing UK nationals about what they need to do to secure their status is a responsibility on both the relevant EU authorities plus the responsibility of the British government as well? Is that what you're saying, is that you've had both?
Yes, and my view is that yes, the FCO, it is their remit to deal with UK citizens in the EU. I mean, we are part of their responsibility, so they have responsibility for us, as well as where they have delegated this responsibility for informing or helping and supporting UK citizens, the organisations under the UK National Support Fund. But as Kalba explained, that's for a very limited and restricted amount of hand-holding work. It's not clear that they are all under, the organisations are under an obligation to provide information. So I would say the FCO probably has primary responsibility plus the organisations, and then member states also have responsibility under the withdrawal agreement to inform.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that one about the responsibility before I move on to the next question? Kalba or Malcolm? Michael, sorry. No? Just to pick up then on the organisations that tendered and contracted to give support to UK nationals, you touched, Kalba, on the opinion that they didn't necessarily have the expertise in the area of citizens' rights within the withdrawal agreement. So what measures do you think can be taken or proposals made to improve this? I'll go to you first.
Okay. Yeah. I think the most important thing will be monitoring. I think it will be important to get feedback from users because obviously the organisations are set up to help people, so it will be very important to hear from them. But it needs to be monitored on an ongoing basis by the FCO. And I think that, I mean, there does need to be some more public clarity about exactly what their remit is, because it's actually very difficult to complete an application form for a resident status without touching on the subjects of whether somebody is legally resident or not. And it's the issues of legal residence that are incredibly complicated under the withdrawal agreement. That very often they're based on case law. To give you an example, in British in Europe, we've recently produced a series of 6 explainer articles on the withdrawal agreement, which are really, as far as I'm aware, are the only kind of simple reading pieces of information that have been made available to British people living in Europe on the withdrawal agreement. And we've recently done another one covering the guidance note. So we're doing our best to inform people because of the complexity and the way, in a constitutive country especially, application and legal residence are so intertwined. And that's something that worries me personally as an information person. It's something that particularly worries me because we have seen in France people who've been refused residence cards under the current system. In fact, I personally know of 2 people who've been deported in my neighbouring department.
UK nationals have been
UK
deported.
Nationals, yes, last year or the year before.
Last year or the year before, goodness.
Because they didn't meet the conditions for legal residence.
Even when we were part of the European Union. Interesting. Indeed. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think I'm just to echo Kalba that what's needed is monitoring, and the people I've spoken to in IOM, actually 2 people are qualified lawyers, and they said that they would be giving advice about status on the helpline. So I think it's the remit needs to be very clear, and one of the biggest issues here is actually getting to the groups that need it most, and the communications of getting to the unregistered people, particularly, say, who live on campsites or whatever on the coast, or older people who live right up in the hills. So communications is going to be very, very important in this country. Very big country, people spread out, people in the middle of nowhere, and then people who really are, under the radar in lots of ways. And that group, apart from obviously real cases of vulnerable people in care homes, etc. But it's going to be a very, very big job in Spain, and particularly in Andalusia, where it looks titanic as a job, really.
Okay, thank you. Do we have time, Chair, to go to Jane to see if she wants to add anything to that? Jane, would you like to?
We do. Jane, was there anything you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Michael and Kalba has said. I think monitoring is extremely important to make sure that the money is well spent. This is an extremely complex area, the withdrawal agreement. Kalba's referred to the explainers that we put out in January about the withdrawal agreement. She's probably spent about 70 hours putting those into sort of a sort of noddy guide, which would be easy to digest. And then the lawyers in our steering team, I'm one of them, then had to check all of that to make sure that it was legally correct. So, I mean, this is really complex legal advice that these organizations are going to be given. And so it has to be monitored very carefully, because the advice that is given will have huge repercussions for people's lives going forward and their legal status.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure that the people who get the chance to read what you put together are immensely grateful for the effort that you have made. Can I just ask about your request for observer status on the Specialised Committee on Citizens' Rights under the Joint Committee? What has happened to that request?
Okay,
Jane?
well, yes, I'm happy to answer that, Hilary. We put in a request to both Michael Gove on the UK side and Sefcovic on the EU side. We have had answers. In fact, I can update the written evidence that we gave, because since May we have had answers from both sides. The EU answer was fairly non-committal. The UK answer was slightly less non-committal, but we haven't got any further in actually achieving observer status. We haven't been invited to meetings as yet, although the door doesn't seem to be entirely closed on this. And we have, in fact, put in already. We had a virtual meeting with the EC Task Force on the Future Relationship a week or so ago, and we made a pitch then to be invited to the next meeting.
Right. Okay. Well, it would be very helpful if you could keep the committee posted on how that progresses. And the final question from me is this. If I were to ask you, what is the one thing that you are most worried about will not work, may go wrong, that will have a really serious impact on British citizens currently living in other EU member states? What would you highlight from all of the things that you have mentioned today? Michael, yes.
I think the most worrying thing for us actually is the breakdown in relations between the EU and the UK. A no trade deal in the end of this year. If things get nasty, because we tend to be political footballs. This has happened when tension has risen throughout the EU-UK negotiations. There has been, we have very much felt the heat as being in the middle and being political footballs. And if the relationship between the UK and the EU is not effective, if it's not cordial, if there isn't a future relationship, we are in danger of suffering, because it's how people implement things really that matters. We do have the withdrawal agreement, which protects our basic rights, but it depends how things go. So I think a lot of our members and ourselves, we are worried about what can happen politically, because when things go wrong politically, citizens suffer, and we've seen this for the last 3 years.
Thank you. Jane.
Yes, I wanted to add to what Michael said, and I think, yes, the key issue is time is short, and it has been made shorter by the COVID crisis. We've already gone through 3 cliff edges last year. This year, we're again in a window between the COVID crisis and what we expect to happen in the autumn, which is that the member states in the UK will again be making no-deal contingency plans. So that's likely to have an impact on the amount of bandwidth on both sides for informing our members and also for getting on and implementing the withdrawal agreement.
Okay, thank you. Kalba, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yes, just to take up a very specific point, which leads on from what Jane said about how the timing has been squeezed between no deal preparations and now what it may well become no deal preparations all over again. I think my biggest concern, I've got a lot, but I think if I had to pick one out, it would be that in the constitutive countries particularly, people failed to obtain a resident status because there hadn't been a robust communication system put in place to inform them that they needed to apply. And that needs to be put in place now. It's no good waiting because it's going to take many months to get through to everybody. And I'm not yet seeing sufficient evidence that that's happening across the EU. It varies from country to country.
Okay. Well, that concludes this morning's session. On behalf of the committee members, can I express our profound thanks to all three of you, not only for the evidence that you have given today, but for the work you are clearly doing to try and represent and look after the interests of